only 4 convictions, he agreed to show the troopers where more bodies were buried.
The third time they called back and said that he had confessed and they wouldn't need me. So I hung up the phone when we were done talking, got my son off to school, got my husband out the door, and proceeded to fall apart. I started crying. I couldn't stop. I had no control over it. It controlled me. I could see each and every one of those women, how they died, probably hunted down like dogs, wounded and then hunted more.
In his confession, Hansen described how he would take his victims into the woods and hunt them as prey. Over the dozen years that he lived in Alaska, he'd raped more than 30 women and developed many strategies for capturing them.
Drive from work, drive uptown in a hurry, and sit there and just look at the prostitutes walking up and down the street. It'd give me this here sexual big blow-up charge. I got this thrill out of when they would open the door, it was something, a key turned over from right to wrong, to right again, where it was all right on these here prostitutes. I could do things with them that I couldn't do with a good woman.
Program is rated TV MA LSV. It contains strong language, sexual situations, and violence. It is intended only for mature audiences.
As branches crack and crumble beneath your feet, with your heart pounding out of your chest, trembling from the cold, you find yourself in one of the world's most picturesque landscapes. The serene and remote backcountry wilderness of Alaska. You hear the sounds of a river flowing, animals rustling, and the intense winds howling. And instead of a peaceful or serene retreat, you find yourself in a situation truly equal to hell on earth. In a predicament so vile, it could only be the work of a demon, or the devil himself. You find yourself caught up in a sick and twisted game, and in this game, you're the prey. In this game, you are the hunted. Stripped down nude, with bloody feet you run. You crawl and hide from the demon behind you, only to meet an inevitable fate. Hunted for sheer pleasure, hunted for the sheer thrill. This disgusting reality would be the fate of over 17 young women in Alaska between 1972 and 1983. The work of a real-life monster, the work of Robert Hansen, also known as the Butcher Baker. Today we'll examine how Hansen would leave a trail of destruction and depravity that is still felt till today. As with most tales of evil men, in order to better understand them or their motivations, you must first attempt to understand their upbringing and development. And just like a majority of infamous individuals, Robert Hansen's early life was marred by trouble. Born the son to Edna Hansen and to Danish father and local baker Christian Hansen, Robert was born on February 15th of 1939 in a small town of Esterville, Iowa. It's said that throughout his teenage years, Robert was a painfully shy young man, finding it incredibly difficult to socialize with others, often more times than not, spending his days alone. Among his peers, he would develop a reputation as a quiet and mostly awkward loner that would keep to himself. Along with his social troubles, he physically struggled with severe acne that would ultimately scar his face. Hansen would describe feeling extremely self-conscious about his skin, only adding to his set of insecurities. It's also noted that Hansen as a teen and into his early adult life had worked for his father at the family bakery. Hansen's relationship with his father was described as being very tumultuous. Christian Hansen, Robert Hansen's father, is said to have run his family with an iron fist. Described as completely overbearing in all aspects of life, it said that he gave Robert no room for error. From his social life to his home life, Robert Hansen had a fair set of troubles to deal with. Often overwhelmed from his social shortcomings and his domineering father, he would seek comfort and solitude in the sport of hunting, where he would become extremely proficient with a rifle as well as a bow. Along with his skills of stalking and hunting, Hansen had developed a great knowledge of survival and the outdoors. An incident would occur when Robert was 21 years old, while still in Iowa, that would begin the twisted chain of events that ultimately would lead us to the killing grounds of the remote wilderness of Alaska. Fueled by a deep and intense hatred of his former high school and the students that had outcasted and ridiculed him, Hansen, on the night of December 7th, 1960, was arrested for burning down a Hamilton County school bus garage. The garage had belonged to the Pocahontas County Board of Education and housed many of the district's school buses, the same that Hansen had remembered from high school. Hansen had stated he had done it as revenge for mistreatment he had suffered during his school years. He had recruited an accomplice in the arson, another young boy that had been a co-worker of his at his father's bakery. The boy would later confess and implicate Robert as the mastermind and driving force behind the destruction of the garage. After his arrest and conviction for the arson, at still just 21 years old, Hansen would be handed a 3-year prison sentence in Anamosa State Penitentiary. During his incarceration, Hansen would be diagnosed by a prison psychiatrist with manic depression and schizophrenic episodes. It's noted the psychiatrist who had made the diagnosis claimed that Hansen had, and I quote, "The subject has an infantile personality in which they have become seemingly obsessed with the idea of getting back at people that have felt wronged them." Once released from prison, Hansen would go back to his family home in Iowa. He would continue to work for his father, and he would continue to have small run-ins with the law. After taking up a job of tending to a small resort his family had owned in the state of Minnesota, Hansen would meet a girl while there, a girl that would eventually become his second wife, and would be by Hansen's side up until the day of his arrest, Darla Heinrichsen. Darla had met Robert while attending the University of Minnesota, and Darla was in the process of earning her teaching degree. She was described as a driven and by all accounts pleasant woman, who would eventually even continue on in school to eventually earn her master's. Robert, after marrying, would eventually convince Darla to join him on his idea of what would be a fresh start. He had felt stagnant back home, and was seeking somewhere new, somewhere away from his family, and somewhere away from his past, somewhere where no one had known of the real Robert Hansen. He convinced Darla to join him on his journey to Anchorage, Alaska, a new and rugged land. Hansen believed it to be the best place for a fresh start, and he would arrive in 1967 with his newly started family. Hansen, once arriving, would become a part of the community quite quickly. He had opened his own local bakery and became a fixture of the close-knit town. It's noted that Hansen and his family were all well liked by neighbors and their peers, described as being very friendly and well-mannered. All would be as well as it could for a couple of years for the Hansen family in their newfound home. Robert, Darla, and their 2 children had made Anchorage, Alaska their new home and were received and welcomed in return. All that would change on the night of December 22nd, 1971. Little known to his wife or to his children, Robert Hansen had a demon festering within him, all while keeping the facade of a successful business and family man. Internally, Robert was slipping deeper and deeper into a black hole. Unbeknownst to his friends or his family, in Robert's free time, he'd prowl the city, driving and watching, studying and stalking. Robert had always had a deep-seated hatred for women, especially young women, those same girls that had rejected him and ridiculed him growing up, the same girls that had laughed and disregarded him. Even after all these years and building his own family, Hansen still burned with hate. Hansen would drive around the city and would frequent sex workers. In December of 1971, a woman named Patricia Roberts, a known local prostitute, would be forced at gunpoint by Hansen to drive 160 miles south to a motel, where there he physically and sexually assaulted her, before forcing her back into the car and driving back, where he released her in Anchorage. Patricia left completely shaken and damaged, not knowing what to do. She eventually reported the crime to authorities a week later. She had described her attacker in detail, from his face to his voice to his distinct stutter. Hansen would be arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, and assault with a deadly weapon. Once police had Hansen in custody for the assault on Patricia Roberts, they were able to link him to another rape case of a local sex worker who had taken place around the same time. Somehow, through failure of the legal system and through Hansen's manipulations, a plea bargain would be reached. Hansen would only be sentenced to 5 years for the 2 sexual assault cases, and ultimately would only serve 6 months before being set free through a work release program. That same year of 1971, as Hansen served time in prison, police began to discover the frozen remains of young women deep in the rugged wilderness of Alaska. The first body that was recovered was on Christmas Day, December 25th of 1971. 2 hikers had found a nude corpse covered in snow at the foot of a cliff in McHugh Creek State Park. The body would be identified as Celia Van Zanten. She was only 18 years old and went by the name Beth. She had disappeared just 3 days earlier, when she had never returned from a quick stop to grab a soda at her local corner store. She was found frozen solid. Her body was slashed and beaten and had signs of sexual assault, but the coroner had deemed that although having extensive injuries, she had ultimately died of the exposure to the extreme conditions. At the time, the police had no real evidence or proof of Hansen's involvement, and his family and community still viewed Robert in decent light, despite his past troubles and conviction with the law. As the 70s would continue on, more and more young girls would continue to go missing, and more bodies would continue to pop up in the Alaskan wilderness. On July 7th of 1973, 17-year-old Megan Emmerich would go missing after being last seen at her dorm room in Seward, Alaska. Again, in Seward, only 2 years later, on July 5th of 1975, 22-year-old Mary Kathleen Thill would also go missing, where she'd be last seen by a friend who had dropped her off at a local bakery earlier that day. She was never seen again. Throughout the first half of the decade of the 70s, no suspicion ever befell Hansen for the string of missing young girls. Investigators throughout different cities of Alaska had yet to connect the dots between the women and Hansen. But as the decade of the 70s would come to a close, Robert Hansen's bloodlust and hatred for women only continued to grow. In 1980, again all while holding the illusion of being a normal family man and keeping his business as a baker, Hansen would continue living his double life, prowling the seedy underbelly of Anchorage and other nearby cities in his free time, having relations with sex workers and prostitutes. Again, on the morning of July 17th, 1980, a group of workmen would discover the decomposing remains of a young girl buried in a shallow grave in Eklutna, Alaska. The girl's body was already months into decomposition and was partially skeletal. She was clothed, wearing blue jeans and a brown leather jacket. The workmen instantly contacted police officials, and investigators would eventually arrive to the remote and rugged scene. They would determine that the cause of death was from a single deep stab wound to the back, and although through their best efforts, they were still unable to identify the girl, and had no real clue as to how she ended up in the remote wilderness of Eklutna, Alaska. Despite the clues from her clothing and distinct jewelry she was wearing, police officials would never be able to identify this girl. She would remain a Jane Doe till today, nearly 50 years later, and investigators would ultimately give her the name Eklutna Annie, a name she keeps, again, till this day. An unknown soul that was lost in this dark and frozen backcountry. Over the next 4.5 years, about a dozen girls would be reported missing, with a handful of their bodies eventually being found in the remote wilderness of Alaska. Some of the missing girls would never be found. No remains, no clues. Gone and vanished, never to be seen again. And although investigators struggled at first with working the cases, from dealing with the remote crime scenes to the lack and loss of evidence from the environment or animal predation, slowly detectives began forming a pattern and a link to the cases. Although victims and missing persons reports were sometimes separated between hundreds of miles and between different Alaskan cities, a clear pattern had been formed. All the girls that were targeted were young in age, late teens to early 20s. If there was a body recovered, it was typically found in a very remote area of wilderness, typically near a body of water, and most importantly, a large portion of the targeted women had a past of sex work in either exotic dancing or prostitution. From the years of 1980 to 84, the bodies Joanne Messina, Sherry Morrow, Paula Golding, Malay Larson, Sue Luna, Delynn Frey, Teresa Watson, Angela Fettern, and Tamara Peterson would all be found murdered, with their bodies left to freeze in the rugged wilderness. Some were stabbed, some were shot, some had both wounds. Ultimately, these young girls had met a heinous fate. Investigators working the multiple cases at the time had now suspected that there was a monster in their midst. Along with help from FBI investigators and early FBI profilers, a suspect profile was formed as to who could be responsible for the twisted string of killings. Ironically, FBI profiler Special Agent Johnny Douglas had gone on record stating that he thought the killer would have been an experienced hunter with low self-esteem that had a history of being rejected by women and would feel compelled to keep souvenir or trophies of his murders, such as victims' jewelry and other possessions. He also suggested that the assailant might suffer from a stutter, which all ultimately ended up being true. As both local and federal authorities inched closer to an answer, an incident would send this case into extreme acceleration and would ultimately seal the fate of Robert the Butcher Baker Hansen. While investigators were working the multiple cases and checking out potential suspects that had matched the FBI's profile, Hansen would make the biggest mistake up to date. On the night of June 13, 1983, Hansen would offer 17-year-old Cindy Paulson $200 for oral sex. When she got into his car, Hansen had pulled out a gun and told her to do as she was told, and nothing would happen to her. He took her to his home in Muldoon, where there he held her captive and proceeded to rape and torture the young girl. Cindy Paulson later told police that after Hansen had sexually assaulted her, she was then chained by her neck to a foundation post in the basement. She described then how Hansen calmly took a nap on a nearby couch. When he eventually awoke, Hansen then forced her into his car and drove her to Merrill Airfield, where he told Paulson that he intended to fly her to his remote hunting shack near the Nick River area, a remote and rugged area that was only accessible by boat or bush plane. Paulson had crouched in the back seat of Hansen's car, with her wrists cuffed and trembling in fear. She knew that if she boarded that plane with Hansen, that her fate would ultimately be sealed. She decided then that this was her only chance of escape, when she saw that Hansen was busy loading the cockpit of his bush plane, a small single-engine Piper PA-18 Super Cub. While Hansen's back was turned, Paulson had slowly crawled out of the back seat. She had carefully opened the driver's side door, and once out of the car, had immediately bolted towards 6th Avenue. Hansen, seeing his victim escape and now running down the airstrip, panicked and gave chase after her, but Paulson was ultimately able to reach 6th Avenue safely and had managed to flag down a passing truck. The truck driver, a man named Robert Yount, was shocked and alarmed by Cindy Paulson, her disheveled appearance and her cuffed wrist. He stopped and offered assistance while Paulson cried and pleaded that Hansen was after her. The truck driver, Robert Yount, would drive her to the nearby Mush Inn, where she then jumped out of the truck and ran inside. While Paulson pleaded with the clerk of the inn to phone her boyfriend at the nearby Big Timber Motel, Yount, confused and concerned about the odd girl and the incident, would call the police and report the situation. When Anchorage Police Department officers arrived at the Mush Inn, they were told that Cindy Paulson had already left and had taken a cab over to the Big Timber Motel. APD officers then arrived there to find Paulson in a room 110, still handcuffed, disheveled, and alone. She was in a panic as she was taken into APD headquarters, where she then described her attacker in detail. Eventually, police would find the man, Robert Hansen, with him being brought in and questioned by investigators. Hansen vehemently denied Paulson's accusations, stating that she was just trying to cause him trouble because he would not pay her extortion demands. This excuse was one that Hansen had used on several other occasions, in his prior run-ins with the law. Hansen's meek demeanor and humble personality and occupation as a baker, along with his accusations of extortion, would ultimately be enough to persuade police not to charge him with the rape and torture of Cindy Paulson.
When he's driving, I observed everything, because this motherfucker wasn't getting away with it. I knew I was in trouble, and I really, if there was any chance of me getting away, he wasn't getting away with it.
Is there anything else that this man told you?
Just how he said, there were 7 other girls. It really trips me out. What happened to them 7 other girls?
You think you know now?
Yeah, I think I really did.
Although it seemed as if again, somehow, Robert Hansen would escape capture and conviction for his heinous crimes, Detective Glenn Foth of the APD would have other plans. While investigating the murders in Seward of Eklutna Annie, Joanne Messina, and Sherry Morrow, Detective Floth was convinced that one person was responsible for all the killings, and now was able to finally narrow down his search to the unassuming family man and baker, Robert Hansen. From his past in Iowa, to his criminal record, to the detailed description and manner of crime against Cindy Paulson, the only victim lucky enough to have escaped, Detective Floth was now convinced that Hansen was his man. Signed by a judge and able to get a search warrant for the family home of Robert Hansen, on October 27th of 1983, investigators entered the home, where there they uncovered jewelry belonging to some of the missing women, as well as an array of firearms in a corner hideaway of Hansen's attic, which included a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle, the make and model used against some of the women. They also, and most importantly, found an aeronautical chart, or a map, bearing 37 different written X marks throughout the map. The marked chart was hidden behind Hansen's bedroom headboard. Investigators had studied the map and realized that many of these marks had matched the exact sites where bodies of the young women had been found. Hansen, at first in disbelief of the police presence, would ultimately be confronted with the evidence found in his home. Hansen had denied it as long as he could, but he eventually began to confess and blame his victims in an attempt to justify his actions. He eventually confessed to each item of evidence as it was presented to him, He admitted to a spree of attacks against women that had started in 1971. He had admitted his earliest victims were girls or young women, usually between the ages of 16 and 19, and not sex workers, unlike some of the victims who had led to his discovery. Detective Floth was dumbfounded at the level of detail and abuse and destruction that Hansen had caused. Hansen, for all these years, was able to keep up the illusion of being a normal functioning family man and business owner, when in reality, he was considered Alaska's most notorious and prolific serial killer, even till present day. After conducting the search warrant, and once arrested, while being questioned by investigators, Hansen would go into detail of how he committed his crimes in exchange for a potential plea bargain and stipulations with his court case. He described to investigators how he had a fondness for young women, in particular sex workers. He described how he canvassed the seedy streets of Alaska, looking for potential victims, and how he would rape and torture some of these women. He would tell investigators that some of these women he had come across and either physically assaulted or sexually assaulted, he would let some of them go instead of killing them. And most sinister of all, how he would hunt women for sheer thrill, just as he would game at his small cabin near the Nick River.
In his confession, Hansen described how he would take his victims into the woods and hunt them as prey. Over the dozen years that he lived in Alaska, he'd raped more than 30 women and developed many strategies for capturing them.
Detective Floth couldn't believe what he was hearing, as Hansen would continue to go into detail by detail and describe different women and crimes that he had committed over a decade. He claimed that he first began killing in 1970, and although having a total of 37 X marks on his hidden map, which detectives had believed directly corresponded with the location of 37 different bodies, Hansen would only confirm his involvement with 17 of the missing or deceased women. He would go out with investigators and show them the sites of 17 different shallow graves in southern Alaska. Investigators had no clue or had yet to even find 12 of the 17 victims Hansen had shown them. Ultimately, Hansen would eventually be sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He would be imprisoned throughout the country, first at the United States Penitentiary at Lewisburg, in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Then in 1988, he would be returned to Alaska and briefly be incarcerated at Lemon Creek Correctional Center in Juneau. Hansen would eventually meet his demise in the Anchorage Correctional Complex, where he would die of natural causes connected to lingering medical conditions on August 21st, 2014. Hansen was 75 years old.
30 years after being convicted, an Alaskan serial killer has died. State corrections officials announced the death of 75-year-old Robert Hansen on Thursday. Hansen was accused of killing more than a dozen women in Alaska in the 1970s and 80s. He had recently been sent to Anchorage because of health problems and died at the Alaska Regional Hospital. Hansen became known as the Butcher Baker because he ran a bakery in Anchorage. He confessed to killing 14 women, but authorities believe he may have had as many as 21 victims. He was sentenced to life plus 461 years.
The dark and twisted life of Robert Hansen would be one of destruction and death, a man who combined his two skills of hunting and preying on young women, and would go down in history as Alaska's most famous and prolific serial killer, a real-life manhunter. The tales of Hansen stripping women and forcing them out into the Alaskan wilderness would live in infamy in law enforcement and true crime circles. So dark and macabre, the tale of Hansen's human hunting, it would go on to inspire many facets of pop culture, from movies and films to music and crime television series. But unfortunately, just as with most tales of mystery or murder, the truth is typically stranger or darker than fiction. Real lives would be lost, real women, with real loved ones and friends that would have to live with the pain and suffering, the whole left behind by their absence. Hansen would only be officially connected with 17 victims, but investigators had believed the true number was up to 37 or even more. And guys, that about wraps up our episode. And again, I just want to finish with this closing. With most true crime shows and podcasts, we learn the history and speak the name of killers in these stories, not to glorify them, but in the hopes of understanding. Ultimately, while presenting this, most times the victims fall by the wayside and stay just that, as victims, nothing more. Before we leave today's episode, whether you're listening through an audio format or you're watching the visual, I personally want to speak the name of the 17 young women that met at the end of their lives at the hands of Robert Hansen. And I just want to personally remind everyone who happens to come across this episode that these names listed were very much real people at one point. Just as real as you and I, with dreams and hopes of their own, with futures that they'll never be able to see. And again, just before we leave, I'd like to list their names. So rest in peace to Megan Emmerich, rest in peace to Mary Thill, rest in peace to Teresa Watson, rest in peace to Andre Altieri, rest in peace to Sue Luna, rest in peace to Delynn Fry, rest in peace to Lisa Futrell, rest in peace to Tamara Peterson, rest in peace to Malay Larson, rest in peace to Angela Fedorn, rest in peace to Beth Van Zanten, rest in peace to Roxanne Eastland, rest in peace to Paula Golding, rest in peace to Robin Pelkey, and rest in peace to the still unidentified Eklutna Annie. And guys, if you made it this far into the video, I want to thank you so much. Please consider liking or subscribing to the channel, and please follow the show on all podcast platforms if you're interested in an audio format. Thank you so much.